In March 2020, Manuel Ellis died while handcuffed in police custody. 3 officers involved in the incident are now on trial. Officers Matthew Collins and Christopher Burbank face second-degree murder and manslaughter charges. Officer Timothy Rankin is charged with manslaughter. All 3 have pleaded not guilty. Thank you for joining us. I'm Christine Pei. For the duration of the trial, King 5 will recap the biggest developments in the courtroom, and we will discuss what it all means. Today, we sit down with attorney Mark Lindquist, who served as a Pierce County prosecuting attorney for nearly a decade. Also joining us is retired Pierce County Superior Court Judge Brian Tollefson. And here for the first time to discuss is former public defender and Vice Dean for Intellectual Life and Professor of Law at Seattle University, Deborah Ahrens. Thank you all for being here. We're going to have a pretty good discussion on this. But first, let's check in with King 5 Tacoma Bureau Chief Lionel Donovan about what happened in court this week.
The Tacoma police trial has been riddled with starts and stops this week, from jurors experiencing transportation issues to illness forcing court to end early. It's unclear how much these delays have pushed proceedings behind schedule, but the jury was able to hear from both the defense's use of force expert and their toxicologist. On Monday, Renton Police Sergeant Chris Nielsen resumed his testimony about the Tacoma police officer's use of force against Manuel Ellis. Nielsen stated the officer's use of force was justified, and being handcuffed and laying on your stomach generally doesn't have negative outcomes.
As a practical matter, you prone handcuff people all the time as a police officer. And these events happen, but they're very, very rare.
Court reconvened on Wednesday after a 24-hour delay due to a member of the trial getting sick. Nielsen finished his testimony by going over TPD policy, which he says gives officers a certain amount of leeway when it comes to using force. But the prosecution voiced concerns about how Nielsen's testimony was going. At one point, Nielsen compared being in the prone position and having weight applied to himself while wrestling as being similar to what happened to Ellis. State Assistant Attorney Lori Nicolavo said that was problematic.
What he specifically said to the jury, I'm here to tell you about it.
So what's your point?
The differentiation is, Your Honor, you allowed him to go through that line of questioning with defense. And it's not analogous to this case.
The defense then called toxicologist Asa Lewis to the stand. Lewis spent the morning explaining how the body develops a tolerance to different drugs and alcohol. He said the amount of methamphetamine found in Ellis's system, 2,400 nanograms per milliliter, would be considered toxic to the general population. However, Lewis testified that it's hard to say if this amount would be enough to be lethal for Ellis specifically.
We're looking for general trends. So back to your question, given a number, can I tell if this person is alive or dead? Absolutely not.
And there's much to discuss here, but getting into the delays that we saw in the trial this past week. The trial was completely canceled on Tuesday, and the afternoon session was canceled yesterday because of a 6th defendant, Officer Christopher Burbank. The judge determined they could not move forward without him being present, and here is that moment.
If the court thought he'd gone to Montreal, for instance, then he could have voluntarily absented himself, and the court would then be authorized to proceed in his absence. But given that it appears that he's genuinely ill and therefore his absence is not voluntary, we have to await the time when he should be back with us again.
So let's direct this question first to you, Judge Tollefson in particular. Why would the judge, we just heard from Judge Shishkoff right now, why would the judge bring up whether Burbank's illness was genuine or not?
Well, if he absented himself from the case for an intentional reason, not having to do with his physical ability to be there, just it was an intentional absence. Then the judge could make a finding that he voluntarily chose not to appear. Yeah. But if a defendant is genuinely not capable of coming to court, he has a constitutional right to be present during the essential phase of all trials.
Right, and when you're sick, what can you do, right? Yeah. There is no doubt that this has been disruptive, the delays in the trial. Deborah, let me direct this question over to you. The past 2 weeks, we've had those delays. We saw excusing jurors and waiting for jurors to arrive at the court due to some delays there, particularly for the defense. How does this impact the trial for them? This is right when they're supposed to, hit when the iron is hot, and we're seeing these these delays happening?
As a former public defense attorney, delays were not things that we usually were upset about. Usually it gives you more opportunity to process what's happened so far and maybe develop a strategic response to that. But I think you're right. It does disrupt the momentum of the trial. And it's, however, not that unusual, I don't think, to see things like jurors getting sick and having to be dismissed or having other reasons for delays. Oftentimes legal issues might arise mid-trial. So it's not unusual for a trial to drag on longer than it's originally scheduled for.
And we're in that season, right, when people are going to get sick. We just had the Thanksgiving holiday, too. Mark, let me ask you this. Do you think that we're seeing some jury and defendant fatigue at this point? It's already been several weeks. What are your thoughts on that?
The longer a trial goes on, the more often you're going to see people get sick or other things pop up. You know, I will say that generally, as a prosecutor, you want to keep things rolling. You want to keep the momentum going. Clarity is your friend as a prosecutor, confusion is your enemy, and delays are not generally good for the prosecution. But as you just pointed out, here the delay happens in the middle of the defense case, so I'd say it's not good for anybody. But they're going to get it together, and you know, the jurors, as I've said from the beginning, they're waiting to hear what the officers have to say.
We'll get to that in just a moment.
Yes.
We know we're definitely going to talk about that. But let's get a little bit further into the delays. There was a moment earlier this week when a juror was having transportation challenges and they were discussing whether or not to dismiss that juror. The defense for Timothy Rankin actually offered to pay for the juror to Uber to the courthouse and fought hard to keep that juror on the jury. That juror was ultimately dismissed and an alternate took their place. Here's attorney Mark Conrad explaining why he fought to keep that other particular juror.
I just wanted to put on the record that the juror that was removed is the only juror within the panel that was of Asian descent. My client is of Asian descent as well. That was something that I think is stressed within the importance of some of the case law, that when we look at kind of having an appropriate cross-section of our community, and having someone who can be representative of the defendant as well. I think it's embedded within our constitutional rights.
So, of course, we now know that one of the officers charged, Timothy Rankin, is Asian. One of his attorneys is pointing out the importance of keeping that Asian juror on. I want to hear from all three of you on this one. Can you touch on how the jury makeup impacts some of the decisions you make during a trial and perhaps even the outcome, if I can start that question with you, Deborah?
I mean, I do think that parties spend a lot of time on shaping what sort of jury they're going to have and thinking about what kinds of sympathies the jurors might have and how they might process information. And so I think it's something that you spend a lot of time on pre-trial and at the beginning of trial. And it can be very frustrating if you get partway through trial and jurors who you purposely cultivated to be on the jury are no longer there. Sure. And so it is something that can really thwart your strategic plans.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark?
No, I agree with that. By this point of a long trial, the prosecutors and the defense attorneys have kind of decided which jurors they think are on their side and which ones may not be. And clearly the defense thought this juror was on their side. They fought to keep him.
And they specifically pointed out his ethnicity, saying very outright that he was Asian, referring possibly to his client.
Yeah, go ahead. Jury diversity is something the court is focusing on more and more. We, over the years, have expanded the pool of how juries are selected. It used to be registered voters in the old days, and now they've expanded the pool to anybody who has a Washington State ID card or driver's license. And I think they're probably trying to use other methods to increase the pool of available jurors so that you can expand the concept of diversity so that you have a better cross-section of the community coming in to serve as jurors, and it's a very important goal of the courts to try and do that.
And if we can get a little bit of courthouse 101 from you, Judge, what does a judge even know about these jurors before they all start? Anything at all?
No, the judge knows the same amount as the attorneys know,
right.
I gotcha.
Which is very little until jury selection starts.
I think we often forget how critical it is that the attorneys in the very beginning, weeks ago during jury selection, and who they pick. Let me direct this to everybody in the panel. How much of an impact would you say those jurors' life experiences and their perspectives have on the final decision?
I mean, I would say here it's going to have a tremendous impact because this really is a case where there are experts certainly testifying for both parties, but what so much of this case comes down to is the words of a set of officers versus the words of a set of bystanders bystanders and a videotape, and it really, I think, is going to shape people's processing of the testimony and what they view, what their own life experiences are.
Yeah, I agree. This trial, more than most trials, is going to be about life experience and your perspective on things, because this is a hot topic in the community right now, and people walked into this courtroom with feelings on this issue.
Absolutely. Judge, one other thing, when you have to excuse jurors from service, what impact does that have on the prosecution and the defense? It seems, I mean, this is a big deal when you have to have someone not be there for one of the days of the trial.
Well, in some cases, the juror that's excused, both sides say, we agree, let's go ahead and excuse that juror. But in this case, especially with respect to the one juror that was having transportation difficulties, you could tell that that was a tough, tough, tough decision for the defense to have to accept that.
Yeah, and if anyone watching right now is curious what happened, it was, I believe, due to black ice, and there might have been a traffic collision or some sort. So they had some issues getting over here. Another thing that we want to touch on today, the prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the judge are going to be meeting to discuss proposed jury instructions. Specific information on the outcome of those conversations is up right now on king5.com. So, Judge, we knew that this was going to be happening. Can you explain what a proceeding like this entails? Is this typical in a trial like this?
Yes, I think it's pretty typical nowadays for a judge to sit down with all the attorneys in sort of an informal meeting. Usually it's in the courtroom, so if people want to come into the courtroom and watch what's going on, they can do that. But it's usually not on the record, and it's very informal. Sometimes the judge will not come out and wearing his or her robe. He'll come out, or he or she'll come out in the outfit they came to work in, and sit, maybe at a table with all the attorneys. But there are so many attorneys in this case, I suspect that the judge is going to sit somewhere else and just hash out all the jury instructions, usually starting with the state's proposed jury instructions, and then moving to the defense proposed jury instructions.
So, Mark, what's it like for the prosecutors to be drafting these instructions typically?
But this is one of those areas, I think, where lawyers care a lot more about it than jurors. We spend a lot of time trying to get the judge to give us the instructions we want. But in the end, jurors are going to do what they think is the right thing to do, and they'll interpret the instructions in a way that allows them to get to what they think is the right and just thing to do.
What about you? What do you think in terms of what the defense might be thinking?
Right. In theory, the jury instructions are really important because you're going to only be able to consider things that you're instructed on, and that's supposed to tell you how you're supposed to evaluate evidence and what the elements of charges are and so forth. So in theory, they are very important, but I agree. I think that jurors, it's a lot of information that's downloaded on them in a short period of time that's stuffed with legalese. And so I do agree. It's something that lawyers spend a lot of time on and judges are very thoughtful about. I don't know if it's as important from the jury decision-making end.
Perhaps it's just a way to recalibrate a little bit on the attorney's side to just make sure everything's in place. I gotcha. Okay, so we know that this past week was a little bit uneventful because of the delays that we have seen, but as for what is coming up next week, the defense noted they may call another medical expert next week. That expert would be Dr. Michael Levine, a toxicologist and professor of emergency medicine at UCLA. Now, Officer Rankin's defense attorney, Mark Conrad, said that they also were not going to rule out calling more non-expert witnesses. So turning to you all, last minute addition of new witnesses at this point. I know we're still waiting for who we really ultimately want to hear from, right, Mark?
The officers.
The officers, yes. Well, in the beginning when we first started, I think there was a thought that maybe it was only going to be Officer Rankin who was going to testify, but now we know that at least this past week, Officer Collins was set to testify, but we, of course, saw those delays. Right. What is the anticipation looking like going into this? Well,
I've always thought Officer Collins was going to testify, and the attorney confirmed that during his opening. That said, we now have this wrinkle where Officer Burbank may be sick. And so I think this is a case where the jurors really want to hear from the defendants. And I think the defense knows that. And I think they know they need to put their clients on the stand. But you don't want to put your client on the stand unless they're at peak performance level.
Yeah.
And so maybe Burbank now doesn't testify if he's not feeling up to it. And I imagine what they're thinking is if Collins does a good job up there, Burbank basically is in the same boat as Collins.
Yes.
And so perhaps Collins can do the job for Burbank if he does it well. So you're probably not going to get a decision from Burbank's attorneys until after Collins' testimony. It'll be based on how well did that go and how is Officer Burbank feeling? Is he up to the task?
It is certainly going to be a critical day of testimony, that is for sure, from Officer Collins. You know, kind of getting into the defense, Deborah, how critical is this? What might they be doing to prepare the officers who are potentially going to take the stand?
I think some of the things that they'll be doing are just preparing them to respond appropriately to questions, right? They will certainly get friendly questions from their own attorneys, probably more pointed questions, obviously, on cross-examination. And I think that for folks who haven't ever been in the witness chair, it's a really intimidating and stressful position to be in. And people don't always respond as their best selves in that position. And so I think that a lot of preparing a witness is not just anticipating what questions are going to be asked, but preparing people for the emotional experience of going ahead and testifying. And I think that it's true. If you are in the middle of an illness, you're not going to be at your peak. And this is, as I think we've stressed, a case where the witness testimony is going to be incredibly important. I don't think that this is a case that'll be decided on expert witness testimony. Yeah. And the jury is going to be evaluating these people for how credible they seem on the stand.
Right. I know that we heard from the medical expert witness and the use of force witness on the defense side this past week, but it's almost like they're just there, right? I mean, we really want to hear from the officers. Right. You said it from the start, Mark, early on in this whole process.
And on a case of this magnitude, they might even do dress rehearsals. I mean, I would bring in an attorney to act like the prosecutor and really grill my client and see how my client responds.
Yes,
because you got to stay cool under cross.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts, especially from you, Judge, on anything on how things are going so far? We're kind of in the final stretch here.
Final stretch, yep. Yeah. But it's not over yet, so I hope all the jurors are keeping their minds open and plan on not making any decisions until the very, very end of the case.
Certainly. And Deborah, Mark, final thoughts on everything?
And that the weather holds also, so that everyone can get to court. No, I really do think everything's going to come down to the police testimony.
Sure.
And I would think the defense may be just posturing about calling additional witnesses. I don't think we're going to hear from a lot of other witnesses other than the officers themselves.
And I don't know if this state has a rebuttal case. We don't know yet. We probably won't know until it's time to put one on. So there's still some unknowns.
All right, we'll have to keep watching, and of course we'll continue discussing. Our thanks, of course, to our panel of guests today for helping parse all of this out. We will have more trial coverage coming up during our newscast. Of course, you can tune in on our streaming app, King 5 Plus, available on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV. Our weekly recap is also available on our YouTube channel. As always, you can keep up to date with our trial coverage on king5.com and on our mobile app.